Security seals the doors as a text flashes overhead, trapping his denial inside bright white light. The courtroom air tightens immediately, and I stand where the aisle narrows, a thin plastic security wristband biting my wrist as if it knows this room is about to choose sides. The judge doesn't move, the clerk's chair stops rolling, and even the gallery forgets how to breathe while the projector hum holds the ceiling hostage. I am present in my body in a way that feels almost procedural, feet placed exactly where the floor markings suggest shoulders square, eyes forward, because any visible reaction would be misread as weakness instead of readiness. The light from the screen flattens faces into witnesses, bleaching expressions into neutrality, and I watch my husband's reflection fracture across the polished table edge before he realizes everyone else can see the same thing. He opens his mouth, then closes it because sound would only make the silence crueler. The wristband scratches when I shift my hand, a reminder that entry here was conditional permission granted with rules, and I remember thinking how strange it is that something so small can decide who is allowed inside the truth. The bailiff's gaze flicks from the judge to the screen, then fixes on nothing, trained neutrality under strain, while opposing counsel stills a pen mid-air as if motion itself has become suspicious. I feel no rush of triumph, only the sensation of control returning to a place it has avoided for too long, not through volume or accusation, but through visibility that cannot be negotiated away. The room smells faintly of paper and disinfectant, and the projector's fan whine is suddenly the loudest sound in my head because it keeps going even when no one speaks, even when denial loses oxygen. My husband shifts in his chair, the scrape sharp against the floor, and I see the moment he understands that the audience is not the gallery, but the light itself, that the screen has become the authority everyone must answer to before the bench ever speaks. I keep my eyes on the glowing rectangle, not because I need to read what's there, but because looking away would imply uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one thing this room punishes without appeal. The wristband warms against my skin, friction building, as my fingers curl and uncurl, once controlled a habit formed from months of sitting still, while other people decided what counted as reasonable. I can sense the collective recalculation happening around me, the way power shifts quietly when proof enters without asking permission, and how quickly posture replaces argument. The screen doesn't accuse, it simply stands there bright and patient while authority waits to follow. The judge clears her throat at last, not to speak yet, but to signal that process is catching up to reality, and that small sound lands heavier than a gavel. I notice how the doors remain closed, how no one moves to leave because escape routes vanish when truth takes the stage before anyone is ready to improvise. The projector light cuts the room cleanly in half, leaving nowhere soft to stand, and I understand with calm certainty that whatever comes next will not be private. Not for him, not for me, not for anyone who believed this could stay contained. When the judge finally looks up, the light has already decided what cannot be unseen. I'm Emily Carter, 36, a pediatric clinic administrator from Phoenix, Arizona, and I learned early that custody hearings reward stillness more than sincerity. The morning I first noticed the folded guest list, it was resting on the clerk's counter, like an afterthought creased into quarters, names hidden access, controlled by paper rather than voices, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could decide who belonged inside a room, where futures were discussed in neutral tones. This was weeks before the doors sealed, before the projector ever warmed, back when the courthouse felt procedural instead of predatory, and the air still carried the lie that fairness was automatic. I arrived early as always, shoes quiet on polished floors, coffee untouched in my hand because nerves disguise themselves better when they stay hungry, and I watched my husband greet the bailiff with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten, without giving me proof. He spoke easily, smiling at the right moments, confident in the way people become when they believe context will protect them, and I stood just far enough away to be unremarkable, the kind of distance women learn to maintain when they are deciding whether to trust their own instincts. The guest list shifted slightly when a clerk brushed past it, pages, whispering together, and I noticed how my husband's eyes followed that movement, instead of me tracking access, tracking control, tracking who might be allowed to witness what, stayed hidden. We had practiced this routine for months, exchanges through lawyers, carefully worded texts about schedules and logistics, conversations stripped of warmth and padded with caution, and outwardly, nothing seemed amiss, except the quiet way he avoided the screen mounted at the front of the courtroom, as if light itself required consent. The chairs were arranged with bureaucratic symmetry, and the screen hung dark and inert above them, dividing the wall into expectation and possibility, and I caught myself staring at that blank rectangle longer than necessary, not because I knew what it would show, but because something about its presence felt like a promise no one had explained yet. He sat when told, crossed his legs, adjusted his jacket, performed compliance so fluently it almost convinced me I was reading danger where there was only inconvenience, and for a moment I considered how easy it would be to let that doubt soften my resolve. The folded guest list remained untouched, its edges aligned too neatly, and I wondered who decided when names became permissions, when presence became a privilege instead of a right, because custody has a way of reducing relationships to logistics if you let it. When the judge entered, we all stood ritual overriding emotion, and the room settled into a calm that felt rehearsed, the kind that makes you believe outcomes are already written somewhere you can't see. My husband leaned back slightly comfortable, his foot tapping once before going still, a micro-adjustment that meant nothing on its own, but lodged itself in my attention because I had learned to catalog such things the way nurses chart vitals, noting patterns before symptoms escalate. The screen remained dark, reflecting only vague shapes, and the folded guest list stayed folded as if waiting for instruction, and I told myself this was normal, that nothing had happened yet, that suspicion without confirmation is just another way to exhaust yourself. Still, when the clerk called the case number, my husband glanced not at me, but at the door, measuring space, measuring exits, and the quiet certainty that followed felt less like fear and more like alignment, the click you hear when disparate pieces finally acknowledge one another. The screen draws a clean line across the room. I didn't say it aloud, didn't even know why the thought arrived fully formed, but it did, and once it was there, everything else reorganized around it, including my patience. The folded guest list was lifted at last, names checked, permissions granted, and I watched how quickly authority flowed to whoever held that paper, how easily control transferred without explanation, and I understood that access is never accidental in places like this. My husband smiled again when his lawyer whispered something reassuring, the kind of smile meant to communicate stability, and I wondered how many times I had mistaken that expression for safety when it was really just confidence untested by light. The hearing proceeded with the expected formalities, statements entered, calendars referenced, schedules discussed as if children were interchangeable with time blocks, and I stayed silent, listening, absorbing, because reaction was not yet required. The folded guest list was set aside, its role complete for now, and I noticed how my husband relaxed incrementally once it was out of sight, shoulders lowering, breath evening, as though the risk of unexpected witnesses had passed. The screen stayed dark, inert, compliant, and the room's calm deepened into something almost comforting, which was precisely what unsettled me, because comfort in contested spaces often signals a trap already sprung for someone else. I remembered nights when his texts arrived late, phrased carefully, offering solutions that felt more like instructions, and how I had archived them without comment, not as evidence then, but as habit, the way people keep things they don't yet understand but suspect will matter. Those memories hovered at the edge of my focus, not intruding, just waiting while the present maintained its illusion of order. When the judge adjourned for a brief recess, chairs scraped softly, voices resumed their normal volume, and my husband stood quickly, confident again, already speaking into his phone with his back turned, and I noticed how he positioned himself between the bench and the screen, blocking nothing but acknowledging its potential without appearing to. The folded guest list returned to the counter, reset permissions revocable, and I realized then that calm was not the absence of threat but the delay of exposure, a holding pattern before visibility did its work. I gathered my things slowly, movements measured, because haste reads as guilt in rooms trained to observe behavior, and I allowed myself a single breath of recognition, not triumph, not relief, but readiness. Nothing in that room felt dangerous yet, which was how I knew it would be. The first fracture didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived disguised as paperwork, the kind that accumulates quietly until it weighs more than intention. I was standing near the clerk's side counter when I noticed the clipboard with an incident log resting there, its metal clip catching the overhead light in a way that made the page beneath briefly visible before the clerk turned it away. The room was in motion, but not yet unsettled, lawyers conferring in low voices, chairs shifting, the ordinary choreography of a custody proceeding, resuming after recess, and I told myself I was only curious because administration has trained me to notice documentation out of place. When the clerk set the clipboard down again, closer, this time I saw the edge of a printed image tucked beneath the log sheet, a corner of a phone screen captured on paper, and my attention locked onto it before reason could intervene. I waited until the clerk stepped away, heart steady, posture neutral, because urgency attracts scrutiny in rooms designed to catalog behavior, and then I reached out as if to straighten the stack, a small courtesy that no one questions. The image slid just enough to reveal a message, bubble-cropped but unmistakable, with a time of day stamp reading 9:14 p.m. and a location tag that said lobby, and beneath it, a masked account indicator ending in 82 that I recognized without needing to remember why. I didn't read the words yet. I didn't have to, because the existence of the screenshot alone contradicted months of carefully framed explanations about where communication ended and responsibility began. The clipboard felt heavier in my hands than it should have, the metal clip pressing into my thumb as if marking the moment for later recall, and I set it back exactly where it had been unchanged, so no one would register the difference except me. Across the room, my husband was laughing softly at something his lawyer said, relaxed, confident, unaware that a sliver of his private certainty had just stepped into a public process that doesn't forgive omissions. I moved to a chair along the wall back, straight eyes lowered, and let the information settle not as outrage but as calibration, because anger would have rushed me forward when what I needed was distance. The image replayed in my mind without sound, the timestamp anchoring it to a specific evening, the lobby tag anchoring it to a space he had described differently under oath, and I felt the internal shift that comes when doubt is replaced by alignment. The clipboard remained on the counter, unremarkable to everyone else, but I could feel its presence the way you feel a key in your pocket after you've locked the door, reassurance mixed with consequence. I didn't confront him, didn't signal discovery, because premature exposure educates the wrong person, and I had learned the cost of letting information leak before it's ready to work. Instead, I watched how he moved through the room, how his ease didn't falter, how he gestured with open palms when speaking to the judge, later projecting transparency he no longer possessed in full. When the hearing resumed, procedural language filled the air, schedules discussed, responsibilities parsed, and I listened differently now, every assertion measured against the quiet fact of that screenshot, waiting on a clipboard like a witness, who doesn't yet know when it will be called. The judge asked routine questions, and my husband answered smoothly, but I noticed how his eyes avoided the counter, where the clipboard sat not deliberately, not fearfully, just consistently, as if his awareness had already mapped where risk lived. I folded my hands in my lap, counting breaths, because reaction would have read as accusation, and accusation without structure is dismissed as emotion. The clerk returned, picked up the clipboard, flipped a page, and the image disappeared from view, but it didn't leave the room. It had already altered the way I heard every sentence that followed. I understood then that this was not about catching him in a lie, but about allowing the process to encounter a truth it hadn't been designed to expect, and that meant patience rather than confrontation. When the judge adjourned for the day, people rose, conversations resumed, and my husband turned toward me with a familiar expression of reassurance, as if to confirm that nothing had shifted beyond inconvenience. I met his eyes and nodded once neutral controlled, because he didn't need to know that the story he believed intact now had a visible seam. The clipboard was returned to its place near the counter, incident log closed, image concealed again, but the room felt subtly different, less forgiving, as though documentation had begun to outpace narrative. The clipboard didn't accuse him. It quietly rearranged which version of events could survive daylight. I gathered my things slowly, letting others pass, and as I walked toward the exit, I passed the counter once more, close enough to see the metal clip glint, close enough to feel the pull of what was now possible if I let timing do its work. Outside the hallway, noise swallowed the courtroom's restraint, and my husband spoke easily about next steps, about schedules, about reasonableness, unaware that the framework supporting those words had already shifted. I listened without interrupting because interruption concedes uncertainty, and I needed none of that now. The image with its 9:14 p.m. stamp and lobby tag settled into place alongside everything else I had archived, quietly, not as proof yet but as confirmation that the process was about to be asked a question it could not ignore. By the time we left the building, the fracture had widened enough to shape everything that followed. The courtroom felt different the moment we reconvened, not louder or more hostile but sharpened, as if everyone sensed that procedure was about to intersect with something less flexible. I took my seat with the same measured calm I had practiced, eyes forward, hands folded, while the clerk moved with deliberate precision toward the equipment table beneath the screen. The projector remote lay there in plain sight, small and utilitarian, its buttons worn smooth from years of routine displays, and I watched how the clerk's fingers hovered over it with the kind of care reserved for objects that can't be taken back once activated. The judge nodded once to signal readiness, not looking at anyone in particular, and the gallery settled into a hush that felt rehearsed, an audience trained to recognize when something consequential is about to occur. My husband leaned back in his chair, posture easy, confidence intact, because up to this point nothing had challenged the version of events he had offered with practiced fluency. When the clerk pressed the remote, the screen blinked to life, light washing over the front wall and flattening every shadow into clarity, and I felt the room lean forward without moving, attention drawn upward by the simple authority of illumination. The display that appeared was not dramatic, just a system interface showing a queued item, a display log with a timestamp reading 1002 AM, and a source identifier labeled Court Display A, clean and unembellished, the kind of procedural artifact designed to verify process rather than provoke reaction. Still, the effect was immediate, a low murmur rippling through the gallery before collapsing into silence, as people recognized that what they were seeing wasn't content, but confirmation, proof that something had been prepared, verified, and authorized to appear. The bailiff straightened, eyes flicking to the judge and back to the screen, while opposing counsel stopped mid-note, pen suspended as if motion itself might interfere with what was unfolding. I kept my gaze fixed ahead, aware that reaction would be read as intent, and intent was not something I needed to demonstrate when the process itself was doing the work. My husband's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not into panic, but into calculation, eyes narrowing as he took in the display log and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the mechanics of exposure were now visible to everyone. The judge asked the clerk to confirm the source, her voice even procedural, and the clerk responded clearly, reciting the identifier and timestamp without embellishment, each word landing like a rung on a ladder no one could pretend not to see. The witness wave moved through the room in stages. A few raised eyebrows, a quick glance exchanged between attorneys, then a collective stillness as the implications settled, because public spaces do not require interpretation when proof announces its own legitimacy. The projector's fan hummed steadily, indifferent to the tension it had summoned, and I noticed how my husband's foot, which had been tapping earlier, went still, muscle memory overridden by the need to appear composed. The clerk adjusted the remote slightly, thumb resting near the button that would advance the display, and the room seemed to hold its breath, aware that the next action would not be reversible. I felt no rush of vindication, only a tightening focus, because this was not about winning an argument, but about allowing the record to assert itself in a space where denial loses traction. The judge glanced briefly at the gallery, then back to the screen, acknowledging the public nature of what was occurring without commentary, and that small recognition shifted the balance of the room more effectively than any raised voice could have. The moment the display log locked into place, the room understood that procedure had become witness. The clerk advanced the screen just enough to show the confirmation line again, reinforcing the time and source, and the murmurs that followed were quieter, restrained, the sound people make when they realize they are being observed by the same mechanism, observing someone else. My husband leaned forward now, hands clasped, posture attentive, but the ease he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a careful neutrality that read less like confidence and more like containment. I remained still, aware that my role here was not to direct attention, but to let it travel where it was already headed, guided by light, and record rather than emotion. The judge asked a brief clarifying question about the display sequence, and the clerk answered succinctly, confirming that the system logs each activation automatically time-stamped and archived, a safeguard designed to protect the integrity of proceedings like this. The words integrity and safeguard hung in the air, not spoken aloud but implied, and I saw how the gallery absorbed them, faces tightening as understanding replaced speculation. The projector remote was set back down on the table, its job temporarily complete, and the clerk stepped away, leaving the screen illuminated as if to remind everyone that visibility once established does not require constant handling. My husband glanced toward me then, a quick look meant to assess damage, to gauge whether this development had altered my demeanor, and I met his eyes briefly, offering nothing that could be interpreted as accusation or retreat. The judge called for a short pause to allow counsel to confer, and the room shifted again, voices low, movements constrained because even private conversations felt exposed under the glow of the screen. I noticed how people chose their words more carefully now, how posture stiffened, how the public nature of the moment had recalibrated behavior without a single reprimand. The gallery remained seated, no one reaching for a phone, no one whispering loudly as if an unspoken rule had been enacted that this was not a moment to be diluted by distraction. The projector continued to hum light unwavering, and I understood that this was the first crack in a structure my husband had assumed was solid, not because it accused him directly, but because it demonstrated that the system itself had begun to document him. When the judge returned her attention to the bench, the room responded immediately, silence, snapping into place with practiced efficiency, and I felt the weight of what had just occurred settle into something heavier than embarrassment, heavier than surprise. The display log remained visible, a quiet assertion that the process was now actively recording what happened next, and I recognized that this public acknowledgement had shifted the stakes in a way no private confrontation ever could. By the time the judge spoke again, the screen had already exposed more than anyone intended. The hard copy notice letter arrived without ceremony, slid across a polished table during a brief recess, its weight heavier than its thin paper suggested, and I recognized immediately that this was not routine correspondence. It was folded once cleanly, edges sharp, printed on standard office stock, with a header that named an administrative unit instead of a person, the kind of neutrality institutions use when they want distance from consequence. I took it with both hands, posture unchanged, because objects like this demand to be handled carefully, not out of respect, but out of awareness that they are designed to travel farther than voices. The room around me continued its low murmur, attorneys conferring, clerks moving papers, the judge momentarily off the bench, and I let that ambient noise continue as cover while my eyes scanned the page. A short reference code sat beneath the header, 4 characters separated by a dash, followed by a location line indicating an internal office suite rather than a courtroom, and the absence of any emotional language made the content feel colder, more deliberate. The notice outlined a procedural acknowledgement confirming receipt of material tied to the case and noting that prior representations would require clarification, phrased in language that avoided accusation while quietly invalidating certainty. I felt the internal shift immediately, not shock, but recognition, because this letter did not contradict my husband directly. It contradicted the timeline he had relied on. The paper trembled once between my fingers before I steadied it, a reaction small enough to pass unnoticed, but significant enough to register privately, because the logic he had presented could no longer coexist with this acknowledgement. I folded the letter back along its original crease, aligning corners precisely, and set it beside me, resisting the urge to look toward him, because confirmation does not need an audience when it is already written. When proceedings resumed, his tone remained confident, answers delivered smoothly, but now I heard the spaces between his words, the assumptions that no longer held once the notice existed. The letter rested against my leg, a quiet presence, and I noticed how often my attention returned to its weight rather than its content, as if the physicality of proof mattered more than interpretation. The judge asked procedural questions. Calendars were referenced, responsibilities discussed, and I followed along, participating when required, because outward normalcy is the easiest way to protect fragile truths while they settle into place. At one point, my husband glanced toward me seeking reassurance or alignment, and I met his look with the same neutral expression I had practiced for months, offering nothing that could alert him to the recalibration happening beneath the same surface. The letter's reference code repeated itself in my mind, a small anchor, because identifiers like that are how systems remember what people try to forget. During a pause, his attorney spoke quietly with him, gestures restrained, and I watched how my husband nodded, absorbing strategy that assumed stability, unaware that stability had already begun to erode from a point he could not see. The letter did not accuse him of malice. It exposed sequence, and sequence is unforgiving when it refuses to bend. I thought about how often explanations rely on timing, on who knew what when, and how easily those narratives collapse once documentation asserts a different order. The room felt smaller as that realization took hold, not claustrophobic, but precise boundaries defined by paper rather than walls. The notice letter didn't challenge his story. It quietly removed the space where it could breathe. When the judge adjourned again, people rose, voices softened, and I slipped the letter into my folder with deliberate care, not hiding it, simply placing it where it belonged among materials that had begun to align into a pattern. My husband spoke to me in the hallway, tone casual, discussing logistics, next steps, the familiar language of reasonableness he favored, and I responded appropriately because the danger of premature confrontation is that it teaches the other person where to fortify. As we walked, I felt the folder's weight against my side, the notice letter pressed flat inside, and I understood that this was no longer about catching him in a contradiction, but about allowing the process to encounter one it could not resolve quietly. The letter's office location line replayed in my thoughts, reminding me that this acknowledgement had traveled through internal channels before reaching us, that multiple hands had touched it, that the record now extended beyond any single narrative. I noticed my husband's stride confident but slightly quicker than before, and wondered if some instinct had registered the shift, even if his mind had not yet named it. Outside, the light was harsher, less forgiving than the courtroom's controlled illumination, and I paused briefly before the steps, grounding myself in the awareness that escalation rarely announces itself. It accumulates through small, undeniable adjustments. The notice letter remained silent, but its existence had already changed how I would listen, how I would wait, how I would allow time to work on my behalf rather than against me. Once the letter entered the record, the next fracture was no longer a matter of if, only when. The still image appeared without sound summoned by procedure rather than drama, and the room recalibrated the instant it froze into place. I remember the exact quality of the light that day, not warmer or harsher than usual, just precise as if clarity itself had decided to take attendance. The clerk adjusted the screen feed with practiced efficiency, and what replaced the neutral interface was a single frame pulled from a security camera, time-stamped 9:16 p.m. in the corner labeled Camera C3, Lobby East A. Designation bland enough to feel harmless until it wasn't. The image showed my husband mid-motion, one foot angled forward, shoulders turned, phone lifted just enough to suggest intent rather than accident, and I felt the quiet click of inevitability as the past arranged itself into something undeniable. The room did not gasp. It leaned inward, a collective narrowing of focus that told me this was different from the earlier confirmations, because this was no longer about system readiness or process integrity, but about sequence. The still frame did not accuse him directly. It simply placed him somewhere he had insisted he was not at a time that contradicted the story he had delivered with such calm assurance. I kept my hands-folded posture unchanged because this moment did not belong to reaction, and reaction would have diluted what the image was already doing on its own. The judge's gaze lingered on the screen longer than before, not searching for interpretation, but allowing the record to speak in its own restrained language, and I noticed how the gallery had gone entirely still, the way people do when they realize their presence has become part of the event rather than its background. The timestamp glowed faintly in the corner of the image, precise to the minute, and I thought about how many times I had been told that timing was unclear, that memory was unreliable, that recollection softened edges while this frame insisted on its own accuracy without apology. My husband shifted in his chair, the movement small but visible now because stillness under scrutiny reads differently than stillness under assumption, and his lawyer leaned closer, whispering something I couldn't hear, but didn't need to. The still image remained unblinking, its edges sharp, and the lobby's familiar architecture framed him in a way that made context impossible to dispute. I recognized the polished floor, the security desk just out of frame, the directional signage reflected faintly in the glass behind him, all the mundane details that turn denial into logistics when documented properly. The clerk confirmed the source again at the judge's request, reciting the camera designation and retrieval protocol voice even, because neutrality is the only tone that survives moments like this. That line sharpens when the footage pauses. The sentence settled into me fully formed, not as poetry but as recognition, because the division between what could be argued and what could only be accepted had just become visible to everyone. The judge asked a single clarifying question about the retrieval time, and the clerk answered with the same precision, noting the archival pull occurred earlier that morning logged automatically, an explanation that closed the door on any suggestion of manipulation. I watched my husband's expression change in increments, not collapsing, but tightening his confidence, redirecting itself into containment, as he realized this was no longer a matter of narrative, but of placement. The still image did not move, did not advance, did not escalate, and that restraint made it more powerful than any dramatic reveal could have been, because it allowed the room to examine the contradiction without distraction. I noticed how people avoided looking at him directly now, eyes returning to the screen instead, because confronting a person is harder than confronting an image that refuses to negotiate. My own attention shifted subtly, not away from him, but toward the process unfolding around the image, the way authority responds when documentation asserts itself cleanly. The judge nodded once, acknowledging receipt of the information without commentary, and that small gesture landed heavier than any admonishment because it signaled that the record had accepted the frame as fact. The gallery absorbed this quietly, no murmurs this time, no ripple of sound, just a collective awareness that something essential had locked into place. I felt the weight of the moment settle not as triumph but as gravity, because truth once anchored pulls everything else into alignment, whether anyone is ready or not. The still image lingered a few seconds longer before the clerk returned the display to the system interface, but it had already done its work, embedding itself in the room's memory as a reference point that could not be erased. My husband exhaled slowly, hands clasped now, posture attentive, in a way that suggested he understood the cost of movement under observation. The judge called for a brief pause, allowing counsel to adjust, and the room released a fraction of its tension without regaining its earlier ease, because ease does not survive once sequence has been established. I remained seated, breathing evenly, aware that this was the midpoint, not of the hearing, but of the story he had been telling himself about control. The lobby frame, with its 9:16 p.m. stamp and camera designation, had narrowed the field of plausible explanation to something brittle, and brittle things do not withstand sustained attention. Once the image fixed him in place, the rest of his story lost its ability to move. The audio recorder surfaced, quietly placed on the counsel table, with the same care reserved for objects that are not meant to draw attention until they are activated. It was small, matte black, unremarkable in shape, the kind of device that disappears into a pocket when not in use, and I watched how the clerk handled it as if weight, rather than size, determined its importance. The room had not recovered its earlier rhythm after the still image, and I could feel the difference in how people breathed, how chairs were adjusted more cautiously, how even whispered conversations seemed to measure their own audibility. The judge acknowledged the submission with a slight nod, eyes flicking once to the recorder before returning to the bench, signaling that this was admissible terrain, not theater. When the clerk pressed play, the device emitted a soft click followed by a brief hiss, and then a voice filled the courtroom, steady but unmistakably human, carrying the ambient sounds of a public space beneath it. The time of day stamp was announced, first 9:18 p.m., followed by a recorder identifier R7LB, and then the voice continued narrating what it had observed, in the lobby, words delivered without flourish, the cadence of someone describing rather than accusing. The effect was immediate, not explosive, but compressive, as if the room had been asked to occupy a smaller space with greater precision. The voice referenced movement, placement, timing details that aligned too neatly with the still image to be coincidence, and I felt the subtle tightening in my chest that comes when corroboration removes the last refuge of uncertainty. My husband's head dipped slightly, not in shame but in calculation, as if he were testing how much attention the room could sustain before fatigue set in, and I understood then that this was the wrong instinct to rely on. The audio continued, noting the sequence of actions, the direction of travel, the presence of a phone held low and angled away, details that would have seemed insignificant without context, but now functioned as connective tissue, binding separate moments into a single narrative. The gallery remained silent, not out of courtesy but because sound would have broken the concentration required to follow the voice's careful pacing. I kept my gaze neutral, aware that this was not the moment to look at him, because confrontation would have shifted focus away from the evidence and onto reaction, a distraction he could still exploit. The recorder sat between the clerk's hands, its small red indicator light steady, and I noticed how that light commanded more attention than any gesture in the room, because it represented continuity rather than interpretation. The judge allowed the clip to play in full, no interruptions, no clarifying questions yet, as if understanding that fragmenting the audio would dilute its cumulative effect. When it ended, the clerk stated the duration and confirmed the file's integrity, noting that it had been submitted earlier that morning and logged automatically, language designed to close off any suggestion of manipulation. My husband's lawyer rose briefly, posture respectful, and asked a narrowly framed question about the witness's vantage point, an attempt to introduce distance, but the response was precise, grounded in location and time, leaving little room for reinterpretation. I felt the room register this collectively, a shift from curiosity to pressure, because once corroboration appears, authority begins to circle, even if it has not yet entered fully. The recorder was set down again, its role complete for now, but its presence lingered, a reminder that sound carries differently when it has been captured without awareness. I noticed the bailiff adjust his stance, weight shifting subtly as if anticipating escalation, and I realized that this was the first moment where the environment itself had begun to prepare for consequence. The voice didn't accuse him. It placed him exactly where denial could no longer stand. The judge asked for a brief pause, granting counsel time to confer, and the room loosened only slightly, conversations low and restrained, because no one wanted to be the person whose reaction became the next point of interest. I remained seated, hands folded, listening to the hum of the lights and the faint shuffle of papers, aware that the pressure now in play was not emotional but procedural, the kind that narrows options without raising volume. My husband leaned toward his attorney, whispering quickly, gestures controlled but urgent, and I understood that he had begun to feel the walls closing in, not through accusation but through accumulation. The audio clip had done what the image alone could not. It introduced a witness without a face, a presence immune to intimidation or persuasion, and that realization altered the room's calculus. The judge returned her attention to the bench, eyes steady, and asked a single question about chain of custody, which the clerk answered succinctly, citing timestamps and system logs, each reference reinforcing that this was no longer a matter of competing stories. I felt a flicker of something like apprehension, then not fear, but awareness, because pressure rarely builds without consequence, and consequence does not discriminate between those who seek it and those who merely stand nearby. The gallery absorbed this quietly, heads angled toward the bench, toward the recorder, toward the invisible witness, whose words now occupied space among us. I understood that whatever came next would not be contained to paperwork alone, that authority, once alerted by pattern rather than incident, has a way of asserting itself fully. My husband straightened, attempting composure, but the effort read differently now, less like confidence and more like bracing. As the recorder went dark, the room shifted from listening to waiting, and waiting carries its own threat. The phone was placed face up on the counsel table with deliberate care. Its screen dark speaker icon already selected a small procedural decision that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. The room had learned how to watch by now, attention trained on objects rather than people, and I felt that collective focus settle the instant. The clerk confirmed the audio source and location aloud, noting the conference room designation and a timestamp of 9:19 p.m., as if reciting coordinates rather than history. My husband stiffened almost imperceptibly, shoulders drawing in, because this was different from the earlier confirmations. This was his own device, his own words, about to enter a space where context would no longer protect him. The judge nodded once to authorize playback, expression unreadable, and the clerk tapped the screen, the faint click echoing louder than expected in the charged quiet. A brief tone sounded, then his voice filled the courtroom, unguarded, confident in the way people sound when they believe they are unseen, the cadence unmistakable even before the content registered. The speaker carried the words cleanly, every inflection intact, and I watched how the gallery leaned forward, as if proximity might change meaning, as if closeness could soften what was already fixed in sound. The message referenced timing and intention, casually framed as logistical reassurance, but the language contradicted the narrative he had maintained under oath, not emotionally but structurally, because it acknowledged presence and purpose, where absence had been claimed. I kept my eyes on the bench, aware that watching him would read as confrontation, and this moment belonged to process, not reaction. The phone remained still, its volume steady, transforming private certainty into public record with ruthless efficiency. The judge allowed the clip to play in full, no interruptions, no clarifications, because interruption implies doubt, and doubt no longer served the court. I noticed how the words aligned with the still image and the witness audio, how the sequence tightened into something coherent and unforgiving, and the last refuge of coincidence collapsed under its own weight. My husband's lawyer shifted in his chair, hand hovering near a legal pad, as if searching for a margin wide enough to absorb this reversal, and then stopping because some information resists annotation. The voice on the speaker concluded with a phrase meant to reassure, the kind of ending people use to signal closure, and the silence that followed was immediate and absolute, as if the room needed a moment to recalibrate after the loss of ambiguity. The clerk announced the file's end time and confirmed the device identifier and room location. Again neutral language, sealing the playback into the record, and I felt the shift happen not as relief, but as clarity. This was the moment the story inverted, not because something new had been introduced, but because the same facts now pointed in only one direction. My husband did not look at me. His attention fixed on the phone, then the bench, calculating how far strategy could stretch when the ground beneath it had changed shape. I breathed evenly, hands folded, aware that composure now functioned as credibility, and credibility would matter in the hours that followed. The gallery remained silent, phones untouched, whispers absent, because everyone understood that distraction would be noticed, and noticed things tend to become part of the story, whether intended or not. Hearing his own voice undo months of careful denial changed the temperature of the room instantly. The judge asked one measured question about the submission process, and the clerk answered succinctly, citing automated logging and chain of custody procedures, each reference, reinforcing that this reversal had not been orchestrated, theatrically, but assembled methodically. I watched how authority recalibrated in response, posture shifting from evaluation to preparation, because once contradiction becomes undeniable, institutions move from listening to deciding. The phone was silenced and set aside its role complete, but its impact lingered, a residue of certainty that no amount of explanation could dissolve. My husband straightened, attempting to reassert control through posture alone. But the effort read differently now, less like confidence and more like containment, because containment is what people reach for when expansion is no longer possible. The judge called a short recess voice, even procedural, and the room released a fraction of its tension without regaining its earlier elasticity, because reversals do not unwind easily. I remained seated, aware that this was the point where preparation, which I had concealed carefully, began to surface, not through confession, but through alignment, as each piece settled into place without my intervention. The conference room reference and timestamp echoed in my thoughts, coordinates that had traveled from private space to public consequence without distortion, and I understood that this was the hinge on which everything would turn. When people stood, movements were slower, conversations muted, as if everyone sensed that the next act would not belong to argument, but to authority responding to proof. My husband's gaze flicked toward the door, then back to the bench, measuring options that had narrowed abruptly, and for the first time I recognized not panic but recognition in his expression. The phone had done what strategy could not. It had collapsed possibility into fact, leaving no room for reinterpretation. Once his voice filled the room, there was no version of events left to argue. The keycard appeared during the lull after recess passed from the clerk to the bench, and then to counsel with a restraint that suggested its importance exceeded its size. It was an unremarkable plastic rectangle scuffed at the corners, the kind of thing people carry without thinking until it stops opening doors. I watched it move across the room, aware that objects like this don't shout, they narrow possibilities quietly. The clerk referenced the access summary aloud, noting a window between 9:12 p.m. and 9:20 p.m., and a door identifier labeled East Lobby Secure Language, precise enough to sound harmless until you understood what it excluded. The judge's eyes followed the keycard, then lifted briefly toward my husband, and the shift in attention felt heavier than accusation because it asked a single question without voicing it. How many explanations remain when movement itself has been logged? My husband sat straighter, hands clasped, posture attentive in a way that suggested he was bracing rather than listening, and I recognized the look from earlier months when plans collapsed faster than improvisation could compensate. The clerk explained that the log recorded entries and exits automatically, time windows generated by system triggers rather than human input, and the words automatic and system landed with particular force because they removed intent from the equation. I felt the room compress again, attention converging on the small object that had quietly tracked what memory could not revise. The access summary was displayed briefly on the screen, columns of times and identifiers aligned with clinical neatness, and I noticed how quickly eyes moved to the gaps rather than the entries, because absence often tells a clearer story than presence. The window matched too closely with the earlier confirmations to be coincidence, and I felt the final edge of doubt give way inside me, replaced by a calm that comes when choices simplify. My husband's lawyer rose, posture careful, and asked a narrowly tailored question about potential shared access, an attempt to widen the field just enough to introduce uncertainty, but the response was immediate and precise, clarifying that the keycard was uniquely assigned during that period. The room absorbed this without sound the way people do when the answer removes the last viable detour. I kept my gaze forward, aware that reaction now would read as direction, and direction was unnecessary when the process had already found its path. The judge asked one follow-up about the door's proximity to the lobby camera, and the clerk confirmed alignment, noting overlapping coverage that reinforced sequence rather than complicating it. My husband exhaled slowly, a controlled release meant to signal composure, but the movement drew attention now because stillness had become the safer choice. I felt the countdown begin, not marked by a clock on the wall, but by posture and pacing, the way authority leans in when decision time approaches. The keycard rested on the bench, inert, its work complete, and yet it dominated the room more than any voice because it represented movement quantified rather than remembered. I thought briefly about how often access is mistaken for entitlement, how easily doors open until they don't, and how systems are designed to notice only when boundaries are crossed. The judge allowed counsel a moment to confer, and the room loosened slightly without returning to ease because the pressure now was directional, moving toward resolution rather than dispersal. My husband leaned toward his attorney, whispering quickly, hands gesturing once before stopping, and I understood that strategy was shrinking options, collapsing into a single corridor. I remained still, breathing evenly, because this was not the moment to advance or retreat, only to allow time to complete its work. The access summary returned to the screen briefly, the time window highlighted again, and I noticed how the gallery followed the numbers with an intensity usually reserved for verdicts, because numbers feel impartial even when they are devastating. When the access window aligned with every prior detail, the room lost its last excuse for uncertainty. The judge nodded once, not in approval or condemnation, but in acknowledgement that the field of explanation had narrowed to something brittle. The clerk collected the keycard and the printed summary, placing them carefully into the record, and the act felt ceremonial in its finality, because once something enters that space, it does not leave unchanged. I sensed the shift from listening to preparing, the subtle change in how authority organizes itself when the next step is inevitable. My husband glanced toward the door again, then back to the bench, measuring distance and timing in a way that would have felt strategic earlier but now read as reflex. The gallery remained silent, phones untouched, conversations deferred, because everyone recognized that interruption at this stage would be remembered. The judge announced that the court would proceed shortly, voice even procedural, and the words shortly carried weight because they implied immediacy without haste. I felt my own focus sharpen, not with anticipation, but with readiness, because forced decisions do not wait for comfort. The access log had done what argument could not. It had reduced possibility to sequence, sequence to placement, placement to consequence. I gathered my folder without opening it, aware that the materials inside had already served their purpose by aligning rather than persuading. The keycard's absence was felt even after it was removed, a ghost of access now closed, and I understood that whatever came next would not hinge on interpretation, but on authority, responding to proof it could not ignore. By the time the judge called the room back to order, the door had already closed behind him. The bright stage spotlight came on with a soft mechanical click, flooding the front of the courtroom in white clarity that erased the last shadows anyone could hide behind. The clerk stood beside the equipment table, hands steady while the projector warmed again, its glow sharper than before, tuned for display rather than preparation. I felt the shift immediately, not in volume but in posture, as everyone in the room adjusted to the understanding that this was no longer a procedural checkpoint, but a public reckoning. The judge nodded once, granting permission without commentary, and the clerk advanced the feed, the screen filling with a verified text thread bordered by system markers. Each message aligned with timestamps that read 9:13 p.m., 9:16 p.m., 9:19 p.m., precise to the minute, accompanied by a source verification line confirming the device and origin. The gallery leaned forward as one, a synchronized movement that felt almost involuntary, because this was not interpretation or summary, but language rendered undeniable through light. My husband's shoulders tightened, not collapsing but bracing, as his private words occupied public space without distortion. The casual phrasing and confident tone preserved exactly as he had sent them. I kept my gaze fixed ahead, aware that this was the moment reaction would be most tempting and most damaging, because the truth here did not require emphasis. The messages scrolled, slowly controlled by the clerk's deliberate pacing, each line appearing long enough to be read, absorbed, and recognized for what it contradicted. The judge allowed the display to continue uninterrupted, her expression neutral, because interruption would have implied uncertainty where none remained. The spotlight's glare flattened every face into witness, and I noticed how even the bailiff's stance shifted weight, redistributing, as if the room itself were preparing for formal consequence. The text thread confirmed intention, plainly referencing location and timing, with a familiarity that aligned perfectly with the still image, the witness audio, and the access log, and the cumulative effect was devastating, not because it was dramatic, but because it was coherent. My husband did not look at me. His attention locked on the screen, then the bench, recalculating a world that had just narrowed to a single path. The clerk paused the display at the final message, its timestamp and source verification, glowing faintly at the bottom, and read the identifiers aloud for the record, voice even procedural, sealing the truth into the court's memory. The gallery remained silent, not out of courtesy, but because sound felt inappropriate in the presence of something so final. I felt the weight of preparation surface then, not as confession but as alignment, the quiet realization that everything I had held back had arrived intact without my intervention. The judge asked one measured question about verification, and the clerk responded succinctly, citing automated capture and system confirmation language designed to close every remaining door of doubt. When the final message locked into view, the room understood that denial no longer had a language. Only then did authority move fully, the judge, signaling to the court officer with a subtle gesture, an acknowledgement that proof had crossed the threshold required for action. The officer stepped forward, badge catching the spotlight's edge, not dramatic, just present, because authority does not rush when it knows it has arrived on time. My husband straightened, hands flattening on the table, posture careful, as if stillness might restore balance, but the effort read differently now, less like control and more like compliance. The officer spoke quietly to the bench, and the judge responded with the same calm she had maintained throughout, outlining next steps with procedural precision, because justice here would not be theatrical, it would be exact. The spotlight remained on, unwavering, and I realized how deliberately it had been positioned, not to accuse, but to ensure visibility, to remove any pretense of privacy from what had already entered the public record. The gallery absorbed this without movement, eyes forward, phones untouched, because everyone understood that this was the point of no return, not emotionally but administratively. I felt no surge of triumph, only a steady grounding, because exposure does not feel victorious when it has been earned through patience rather than confrontation. The clerk closed the display carefully, the screen returning to neutral, but the light stayed on, an intentional choice that kept the room anchored in clarity rather than relief. My husband glanced once toward the door, then back to the bench, options exhausted, and I recognized the moment for what it was, the end of argument and the beginning of consequence. The judge concluded the session with formal language directing records to be secured and follow-up actions scheduled, her tone unchanged, because the work of authority is most powerful when it refuses spectacle. I gathered my folder without opening it, aware that its contents had already spoken, and remained seated until instructed otherwise, because control now belonged to the process, not to any individual. Under the spotlight, the truth stood long enough for authority to step forward and take it. The sealed legal envelope was placed on the table between counsel, with deliberate care, its surface thick and uncreased edges pressed flat, as if to emphasize that what it contained had already been decided before it ever touched the room. I watched the clerk slide it forward, fingertips lingering just long enough to confirm receipt, and I understood that this was the moment when accumulation stopped and consequence began. The envelope didn't look dramatic. It wasn't meant to. Its weight came from finality rather than spectacle, from the quiet authority of paperwork that no longer asks for interpretation. The judge addressed the room with the same measured tone she had used throughout, outlining the court's determination, step-by-step language, precise, procedural, immune to interruption, and I noticed how every sentence landed without resistance. Now that proof had completed its work. My husband sat still, hands folded, posture attentive in a way that suggested compliance rather than confidence, and I recognized how different that stillness felt from the ease he had worn at the beginning, when control had been assumed, rather than tested. The gallery listened without movement, not because they had been instructed to, but because nothing in this moment invited reaction, only acknowledgement. The judge referenced the record, not repeating details, trusting that everyone present understood how each piece had aligned, and the absence of repetition felt intentional, a reminder that once truth is established, it does not need to be performed again. The sealed envelope remained untouched for a beat longer than necessary, a pause that allowed the gravity of the decision to settle before it was opened, and I found myself focusing on the sound of the room, the faint hum of lights, shuffle of paper, the steady rhythm of breathing, because those details grounded me more than any sense of vindication could have. When the judge instructed counsel to review the contents, the envelope was opened cleanly, no tearing, no hesitation, the seal broken with a practiced motion that respected process rather than emotion. Inside the documents were neatly stacked margins, aligned signatures already in place, and the language within them was exact, outlining custody arrangements with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. I listened as the judge summarized the outcome, not because I needed to hear it to believe it, but because listening signaled respect for the system that had carried the truth to this point. My husband's lawyer nodded once, acknowledging receipt, and my husband did the same, a gesture that felt less like agreement and more like recognition that resistance would only prolong what had already concluded. I felt the shift internally then, not relief, not triumph, but a release of vigilance, the easing that comes when you no longer have to anticipate the next denial. The judge addressed me directly for the first time since the spotlight dimmed, her voice neutral, confirming my understanding of the terms, and I answered clearly because clarity is the currency of rooms like this. The sealed envelope was set aside, its contents now active, its role complete, and I noticed how quickly the room began to reorganize around the new reality chairs, adjusting counsel, preparing next steps, authority redistributing itself with quiet efficiency. When the envelope opened, the fight didn't end, it simply lost its audience. The judge concluded the session with formal language, outlining timelines and expectations with the same precision that had guided the hearing, and the absence of flourish felt appropriate because justice delivered cleanly does not need emphasis. The bailiff stepped forward to signal the close of proceedings, movement, restrained, respectful, and the gallery rose almost in unison, not hurried but purposeful, because the moment demanded order rather than commentary. I gathered my things, slowly aware that haste now would read as instability and stability was something I had earned through patience rather than argument. My husband stood as well, adjusting his jacket movements careful, and for the first time his attention flicked toward me, not with calculation, but with something closer to acknowledgement, an understanding that the ground between us had shifted, irreversibly. We did not speak. There was nothing left to clarify, nothing to negotiate, and the silence felt appropriate, not tense but complete. The judge exited the bench clearing with practiced efficiency, and the room exhaled collectively the pressure, releasing without noise. I noticed how the sealed envelope remained visible for a moment longer on the table, a quiet reminder that decisions here are not ephemeral, that they follow you beyond the room that created them. Counsel exchanged brief words, procedural, restrained, already moving forward, and I realized how quickly systems transition from conflict to maintenance once alignment has been achieved. I stepped back from the table, giving space because space now belonged to process rather than contention, and felt the steadiness return to my posture, shoulders, settling breath even. The hallway beyond the courtroom waited brighter and louder than the controlled space I was leaving, and I paused briefly at the threshold, orienting myself to the shift from adjudication to aftermath. The sealed envelope was collected, filed, absorbed into the system that would enforce its contents, and I understood that enforcement, not exposure, was now the operative force. As the room emptied, the paperwork stayed behind, carrying consequences that no one could argue away. I stand at the glass podium now, the same one that caught the spotlight days ago, its surface cool beneath my palms, reflecting my hands back at me with a clarity that no longer feels threatening. The courtroom is quieter than I remember, not emptied of people but emptied of pressure, as if the room itself has released what it was holding once the record closed and authority finished its work. I am present in this moment in a way that feels earned, rather than defensive, breathing evenly, posture steady, because there is nothing left here that needs guarding. The glass holds faint smudges from earlier fingerprints layered over one another, reminders that many hands pass through this space carrying different intentions, and I notice how easily those marks fade when light shifts visibility, changing what remains. I look out toward the benches, now sparsely occupied clerks, moving methodically, voices low and procedural, and I feel the absence of urgency more sharply than its presence ever registered. The hum of the lights is softer without tension, amplifying it, and the air carries the neutral scent of disinfectant and paper, familiar and oddly grounding. I remember how I once measured rooms like this for exits, for angles, for where eyes might land if I moved too quickly, and how that vigilance has loosened into something quieter now that the work is done. The podium's glass edge catches a thin line of light, dividing reflection from transparency, and I recognize the image without flinching. Nothing remains outside the light. The thought settles fully, not as revelation, but as closure, because there is no part of this story left unacknowledged by the process that received it. I gather my folder from the podium shelf lighter than it has been in months, not because pages are missing, but because their purpose has been fulfilled. The judge is not here now. Authority has moved on to enforcement and scheduling, to calendars and follow-ups, the unglamorous labor that ensures decisions persist beyond rooms like this. I step back once, then again, shoes quiet on the floor, aware of how different my movement feels, without the need to anticipate reaction. The glass podium reflects my outline as I move away, a brief doubling that dissolves with distance, and I realize how often reflection once felt like exposure rather than confirmation. In the hallway, voices rise and fall, ordinary conversations resuming around logistics and next steps, and I move through them without needing to manage perception, because perception no longer dictates outcome. The doors at the end of the corridor stand open, no longer sealed, and the freedom of that openness feels almost understated after so much structure. Outside daylight is harsher than the courtroom's controlled illumination shadows, sharper edges, less forgiving, and yet I do not feel the urge to shield myself from it. The world continues at its own pace, indifferent to what concluded inside, and that indifference is oddly reassuring. I pause briefly on the steps, grounding myself in the present, noticing the sound of traffic, the movement of people who have no stake in my story, and I allow that separation to exist without resentment. The past days replay in fragments rather than scenes, now a timestamp here, a still image there, the sound of a voice carried through a speaker, each piece settling into memory without demanding interpretation. I no longer rehearse responses or anticipate counter-arguments, because the need for readiness has given way to something simpler, a steady acceptance that the truth has found its place. I think about the children, about schedules that will now be followed rather than debated, about consistency replacing negotiation, and the relief that comes from knowing that stability no longer depends on vigilance alone. The legal language will continue to do its work quietly in offices and systems I will never see, and I trust it in a way I couldn't before, not because it is perfect, but because it has proven capable of listening when evidence speaks clearly. I walk to my car without checking behind me, keys warm in my hand, the ordinary ritual of leaving feeling newly unburdened. The glass podium fades from my awareness, its role complete, a stage that did what it was meant to do, and then released me back into motion. I drive away without looking back at the building, not out of avoidance, but because there is nothing left there that belongs to me now. The road opens ahead, unremarkable and steady, and I merge into traffic with the same patience I learned inside those walls, understanding that forward movement does not require spectacle. The line of light I once feared has become a guide rather than a threat, a boundary that clarified instead of divided, and I carry that understanding with me as the city absorbs my departure. I leave, knowing the light stays even when I don't.